The mission was supposed to be routine. A patrol in a quiet valley in northern Syria, tracking what was classified as a low-significance arms transfer. Just another dusty pass, another small convoy, another night in a region so volatile it barely registered anymore on the global radar. 6 MARSOC operators were deployed with minimal fanfare and limited support, told to move fast, stay dark, and observe. Their satellite feed showed 1 technical, a handful of foot mobiles, and a trail narrow enough to control with 1 solid fire team. Simple, quiet, no surprises. But what none of the maps showed, what none of the chatter had warned, was what waited beyond that first hill. The valley wasn't a transport corridor. It was a trap. Layered, controlled, occupied. The convoy wasn't real. It was bait, and they had taken it. By the time they realized the setup, the sun was beginning to fall behind the ridge, and the enemy had already begun to push forward from 3 directions. Communication with Overwatch became patchy, and the drone feed dropped out. Calls for fire support were met with static. And then came the technicals. 2, then 3. Mounting DSHKs that stitched the ground around their fallback point with rounds the size of fists. What was supposed to be an observation patrol was now a fight for survival. For the first few hours they held. Controlled bursts, disciplined movement. Every engagement was efficient, surgical. But the enemy didn't stop coming. There was no room to maneuver. The terrain offered no high ground. Their gear was bleeding dry, rounds disappearing with every burst, grenades already used, battery packs fading, and their last SAT burst unreplied. The final click of an empty magazine hit harder than the explosion that followed. It echoed not just in the chamber, but in their bodies, in their minds. That metallic sound meant something deeper. They were out. Not running low, not rationing. Out. They had trained for this. Not exactly, but close. Operating without support. Pushed to the edge, making do with blades, fists, dirt, and desperation. But training ends where darkness begins. Because when the sun vanished and the wind dropped, the valley transformed. Shapes became shadows. Shadows became whispers. Whispers became death. The enemy adapted. They came quiet. Smarter. They knew the MARSOC team was bleeding. They knew they were tired. They knew they were nearly empty. But what they didn't know, what they could never have understood, was that even when a Marine Raider runs out of bullets, he doesn't stop fighting. What happened next didn't come from a plan. It came from instinct. From muscle memory fused with rage, fused with survival, fused with the impossible loyalty that only men who've bled together can know. They didn't wait to die. They used everything, the terrain, the light, their own heartbeat, to bend the fight back in their direction. This is the story of 6 men who faced the impossible, who ran out of ammo in the middle of a war zone, who looked into the eyes of death not with fear, but with calculation. This is the night the ammo ran out. And they didn't. At 0200, the operations room of FOB Falcon was still half asleep, its harsh fluorescent lighting reflecting off plastic map covers and steel tabletops. The desert wind outside whistled low through sand-clogged vent slats, but inside, 6 men sat silent, fully kitted in gear designed for terrain none of them had yet seen. A monitor in the corner of the room cycled satellite feed every few seconds, each frame showing the same narrow strip of elevation in northern Aleppo. Low ridgelines, intermittent movement, nothing extraordinary. The target area was designated Zone Violet, a narrow valley intersected by a known smuggling trail and flagged by CENTCOM for intermittent weapons transfers. The intel brief was minimal. 1 technical vehicle, likely 24 combatants at most, presumed to be low-tier militia loyal to a non-aligned local warlord. The mission was simple: intercept, record, sabotage if possible, exfil. The team had been briefed earlier that day, but new drone imagery added just enough ambiguity to warrant one more sit-down. There was no mention of heavy armor, no mention of reinforced fighting positions. The pattern of life on the ground had been labeled static, intermittent patrols, no signs of NVG use. In short, the mission was sold as clean, manageable, a patrol with teeth but not claws, no support element, no QRF. If anything went wrong, they'd be on their own. The team was composed of 6. Gunnery Sergeant Kyle Rourke, team leader and JTAC, on his 3rd Syria rotation. Corporal Marquez, comms specialist and sharpshooter. Staff Sergeant Davis, the corpsman, and 3 other seasoned operators with overlapping skills in breaching, EOD, and small unit tactics. They had worked together before, quietly, efficiently, without the need for excess. They didn't talk much, they didn't need to. This mission was the kind they were trained for. In, observe, act if necessary, extract. By 0310, the team was wheels up. A blacked-out CH-47 powered into the sky, cutting low across the Turkish border, hugging terrain under radar shadow. No cabin lights, no chatter. Each man sat silent in the belly of the aircraft, their rifles across their laps, hands closed over sling straps as if willing themselves into the terrain before they even arrived. Their insert point was a dried riverbed just north of the valley, chosen for its minimal elevation profile and natural cover. They would drop, move by foot for roughly 4 kilometers, and establish overwatch on the western ridge by sunrise. The drop was clean. The bird barely touched skids to dirt before the team was off, their boots crunching over sand and scattered rock. In the distance, the ridgelines loomed like sleeping animals, sharp against the starfield overhead. Visibility was good, moonlight low but steady. They moved in staggered column, weapons forward, every step rehearsed in a dozen other countries under a dozen other names. The desert at night was never truly silent. Occasional wind through dead brush, the distant growl of engines far off in the hills. But there was no sign of the enemy yet. By 0430, they reached their first temporary overwatch point, a ledge flanked by natural rock cover and half-shielded from aerial view. Marquez set up the spotting scope, Rourke laid out the SAT gear, and the others began establishing a 360 perimeter. They had roughly 90 minutes before light. Thermal scans showed no immediate threat. At 0500, movement appeared in the valley. One technical vehicle, white, beat up, a Soviet-era PKM mounted to the bed. 2 men visible in the cab, 3 dismounts moving boxes toward a makeshift tent assembly near the center of the pass, still within parameters. Rourke marked them, logged positions and waited. 15 minutes later, another vehicle appeared. No weapon mount, but with reinforced side panels. Not local militia design. Then another. And then personnel. Not 2, not 5, but close to 20. Spilling out into what now looked more like a fortified checkpoint than a staging point. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. These men moved differently. There was less wandering, more structure. Firing arcs were being discussed, not guessed. Radio signals began to spike, encrypted short bursts. That wasn't local militia protocol. These men were trained. Still, they held position. That was the mission. Do not engage unless fired upon. Do not break concealment. Rourke ordered a full scan of surrounding ridgelines, checking for flanking units or sniper hides. Nothing. Thermal remained quiet. Still, the valley was changing. New crates were offloaded. Larger, metal-reinforced, consistent with munitions or technical parts. At 0615, the team rotated. Second set took observation. First set hydrated, cleaned optics, prepped for extended surveillance. Sunlight crept over the horizon, bouncing off the far ridge in a soft flare of gold. By mid-morning, the staging area had doubled in size, more foot traffic. A communication mast went up, portable, tactical, nothing makeshift about it. A second heavy weapon was mounted. This one, unmistakably, a DSHK. Its presence shifted the tone of the mission entirely. A .50 cal machine gun didn't belong in a minor weapons transfer. This wasn't a pass-through. This was a hub. By 1100 hours, the order came from Rourke. He would escalate the request for reclassification. This was no longer a recon patrol. This was developing into a direct action target. Marquez tried to re-establish a satellite uplink. Connection was intermittent, likely due to local jamming or terrain masking. He switched to encrypted burst mode, fired the data package and coordinates twice. No response. The line remained quiet. That silence settled over the team harder than any briefing ever could. When Hire didn't answer, it meant 2 things. Either they couldn't hear you, or they didn't want to risk exposing you. Neither was good. The team shifted position to a second overwatch to maintain concealment and prep contingency plans. A quick inventory showed that while they were outfitted for limited engagement, their ammo wouldn't hold out in a prolonged fight. Each operator carried 7 magazines, 2 frag grenades, and a sidearm. That would last through an ambush, not a siege. Then came the wind. From the south, pushing grit and fine sand into every crevice. Visibility dropped. The perfect cover if you weren't sitting in the middle of it. At 1300 hours, new figures appeared. Not from the main road, but from the hills. Flanking elements in pairs, using bounding cover. They weren't moving toward the camp. They were forming a perimeter, and the MARSOC patrol was already inside it. Rourke issued a soft alert over the team net. They packed fast, moving to fallback positions, spacing out to avoid a single-point loss. Still no reply from higher. No air assets, no SAT confirmation. Just the crackle of shifting sand, and the unmistakable mechanical sound of a bolt being racked somewhere too close to be accidental. The drop-off was over. The mission no longer resembled its briefing, and in the distance, as the heat shimmered across the valley floor, the first muzzle flash blinked through the grit. The first crack of gunfire cut clean through the howl of the wind, sharper than the grit and louder than the pounding in Rourke's chest. It came from the western slope. An unmistakable 3-round burst fired downhill toward the observation position they had just vacated. Sand sprayed into the air as bullets chewed into stone and dirt. The enemy had found the old hide and assumed the team was still there. That assumption bought them 15 seconds, maybe 20. Time they would need. The MARSOC team had already relocated to a fallback point 50 meters east, dug low behind a natural rock formation flanked by dying scrub. They spread quickly, 3 on each flank, facing outward, rifles up. The environment offered minimal cover, just stone and erosion-cut ridges, but it was better than being pinned in a depression. Marquez raised the SAT antenna again, tried another burst. No confirmation. Nothing. Rourke issued a hand signal, and the team began returning fire with controlled bursts. The goal wasn't to kill, not yet. It was to shape the engagement, to force the enemy to reveal their lines, their numbers, their angles of attack. Within minutes, they saw them. A dozen silhouettes moving in loose wedges, coordinated and communicating. Not just militia grunts, but trained fighters. They fanned out with overlapping sectors, bounding 2 by 2, covering lanes, watching their sixes. Discipline. Planning. This was no ragtag ambush. Rounds sparked off the ridge near Davis. He ducked, rolled behind a stone outcrop, and covered the southern flank. Return fire dropped 2 advancing contacts, both of whom were within grenade range. Rourke fired a 40 mm into their position and used the brief pause in fire to reposition his team. They moved in short, staggered sprints, bounding backward toward a secondary fallback site they had scoped during insertion. They weren't retreating. They were compressing. That fallback was a shallow wadi, dry, cracked earth with a partial overhang of stone. It offered concealment and limited flanking routes, making it defensible with limited personnel. The team reached it just as the second wave of fire hit. The echo of the DSHK ripped through the valley like tearing canvas, the .50 cal chewing stone into dust. They dropped to their stomachs, moving low, hearts pounding in rhythm with the bursts. Marquez fired back from prone, trying to pinpoint the gunner. He found him, 50 meters out, elevated in the back of a modified technical truck parked between 2 boulders. He lined up the shot, held his breath, and squeezed. The shot dropped the spotter. The gunner ducked. Rourke called for indirect fire again. No reply. The comms were black. The surrounding ridges were absorbing or jamming the signal, and no air support meant no overwatch. They were on their own. In the next 10 minutes, the enemy fire increased. Small arms peppered the perimeter in regular intervals, testing defenses. One enemy team attempted a flanking maneuver from the east, but was cut down by Marquez, and another operator with an M4 in single-fire mode. Controlled, efficient, precise. Ammo was already running low. Davis began collecting magazines from the 2 dead fighters they'd dropped earlier. Their gear was cheap. Chinese-made AK variants, most magazines corroded, several half-empty. They wouldn't fit M4S. No cross-compatibility. Useless weight. He kept the grenades, 2 frags, 1 smoke, and passed them out. The sun dipped lower, shadows growing longer. The wind shifted, cooling slightly, pulling dust clouds eastward. With every passing minute, the MARSOC team could feel the perimeter tightening. Movement increased. The enemy wasn't rushing. They were rotating, probing, smarter than expected. Rourke adjusted their firing positions, spacing the team across the wadi to prevent clustered casualties. They dug small fighting holes where possible, reinforced with backpacks and boulders. They created lanes of fire and locked down every angle with overlapping coverage. Then, the RPGs came. The first round slammed into the far edge of the wadi, lifting a 6-foot plume of dust and rock. No shrapnel hit the team, but the blast disoriented them. The second shot hit closer, just shy of Davis's position. He was knocked backward, ears ringing, bleeding from his forearm. Not serious. He reset, shook it off, reloaded. The team leader realized this wasn't a suppression attempt. The enemy was softening them for a final approach. Another 10 minutes passed. Ammo dwindled. 2 operators had fewer than 2 mags each. The others were at 3. Sidearms remained untouched, for now. But the radio was still silent. No QRF, no air cover, no friendlies anywhere within 20 kilometers. Then came the telltale low thump of mortars. The first round impacted wide, likely a rangefinder. The second was closer. The third landed 20 meters short of the team's center position, sending a shockwave through the wadi that tossed dust over everything, blinding half the team for 10 seconds. A shell fragment clipped one operator in the thigh, not deep, but bloody. Davis packed it, tied off a tourniquet, and sent him back to the fire line. It was 1700. The sky darkened slightly, not from sunset yet, but from smoke and overcast. The team's countermeasures were mostly used. The claymores had been deployed early. 2 had detonated. 1 remained. The grenades were gone. What they had left was coordination, terrain familiarity, and muscle memory. Then came the lull. For the first time in 2 hours, the valley was silent. No gunfire, no shouting, just wind. Rourke scanned the ridge. Thermal was dead, batteries low. Marquez tried another radio burst. Still no signal, nothing. The silence felt heavier than the bullets. They checked mags again. 3 operators had less than 20 rounds combined. Another was empty, using a captured AK now, uncalibrated and unfamiliar. Rourke himself had 10 rounds. 1 magazine. Sidearm full, no frags, 1 smoke. They waited. And as the last light began to bleed out over the western slope, Rourke leaned into the dirt and listened. For footsteps, for whispers, for what he knew was coming. The moment the last round is chambered, the fight always changes. And somewhere beyond the edge of that ridge, under the veil of dust and growing dark, the night was preparing to fall. The sun vanished completely behind the horizon with no fanfare, no final warmth. Just a quick fade from red to black as the Syrian sky absorbed the last light of day. The valley descended into a version of night that felt thicker than darkness itself. It wasn't the absence of vision that changed everything. It was the transformation of the terrain into something hostile and unknowable. Shadows now moved when they shouldn't, and the wind carried sounds that felt designed to confuse rather than inform. What had once been a battlefield now became a maze of silence and breath. This was when things turned. The MARSOC team dug deeper into their position, every man pulling his gear closer, checking his chamber and counting his last rounds by feel. No one spoke. The radio remained useless, a dead circuit humming quietly with static. The last drone feed had blinked out hours ago, and now even their own optics were faltering. The NVGs flickered from full function to grainy static, likely disrupted by low battery and local interference. Rourke switched to passive infrared, then back again, trying to balance what visibility remained. But he already knew. They were going to fight blind. They arranged themselves in a shallow arc around the wadi's deepest corner. Each man had a firing lane and a fallback path, pre-coordinated by hand signal earlier. The last claymore was positioned 50 meters out in the only clear approach, tripwired to a broken fence post barely visible in daylight, now completely swallowed by night. The silence outside was deceptive. In between the long pauses, the wind shifted direction twice. Then came the first sound. Stones being disturbed, methodical and deliberate. Not the casual misstep of a local animal. Someone was creeping. Slow. Measured. Watching for movement. Marquez signaled with his fist, the glow stick taped to his glove giving the briefest green flash. Everyone froze, watching the sound grow closer, then stop, then shift left, then disappear. This was a probe. A psychological softening. The enemy knew they were wounded, low on ammo, possibly without backup, and they were going to use the night to dismantle their morale before moving in to kill. 10 minutes passed. Nothing. Then another sound. 3 clicks. Quick and rhythmic. A comm signal, not theirs. Enemy operators using some kind of sound discipline to coordinate without exposing their positions. Footsteps followed, slow, parallel to their flank. Then another direction change. They were walking the perimeter, drawing a map of their defenses from the outside. The team didn't move, didn't blink. Rourke had 1 magazine left. 7 rounds in the chamber. His sidearm sat ready, but he didn't touch it yet. Not until they were close enough to matter. He could hear Davis breathing hard next to him, probably fighting the dizziness from blood loss and dehydration. They hadn't eaten since the night before. Water had been rationed to half a liter per man. The desert night was freezing now. Sweat from the earlier engagement clung to their gear and turned cold against their backs. Then the flare went up. A single red star arced into the sky from the ridge to the west, illuminating the valley in strobe-like pulses of blood-red light. It lit the surrounding rocks and shadows in jarring, unnatural tones. In that flicker, they saw them. At least a dozen silhouettes, crawling low, rifles slung, barely distinguishable from the terrain. The flare hung for 6 seconds, and in that window, the enemy froze. Some were caught out in the open, others mid-crawl. Marquez fired first. 3 shots, 2 impacts, then chaos. The claymore detonated. The blast echoed through the valley, a wide spray of shrapnel and dust ripping through the front line. The team opened fire in disciplined bursts, but already the numbers were overwhelming. Return fire came in seconds, tight patterns, aimed low to suppress movement. Rourke ducked behind a slab of stone as rounds slammed into the dirt beside him. Another operator shifted left to cover their flank, returning fire with the last of his rifle mags before switching to his sidearm. A round hit near Davis's position, and he dropped for cover, trying to stay conscious while dragging a second smoke grenade into position. The pop was weak, the smoke barely thick enough to distort movement, but it bought time. Within 15 minutes, they were dry. Completely. Only 2 rifles still had rounds. Rourke handed off his last mag, drew his sidearm, and repositioned near a low ridge where movement had spiked. He crouched in the dark, heart steady, trying to calculate timing. The enemy had paused again, likely assuming the Americans were broken. They weren't. They were transforming. What happened next didn't look like a gunfight. It looked like a hunting party turned against itself. The MARSOC team began moving silently without signals, coordinating by sheer experience. One operator climbed the back slope and used a discarded enemy AK to fire 2 bursts from an unexpected angle, drawing fire. Rourke flanked right and used a captured flashlight to simulate movement, pulling a second fire team away. Every movement was deception, every breath calculated. One enemy operator stumbled into their fallback and was pulled into the dark without a sound. His body didn't reappear. Another tripped over a buried canteen that had been placed intentionally to draw noise. He died before he could raise his weapon. This was no longer a tactical defense. It was a psychological campaign. The MARSOC team had become ghosts in the terrain, feeding off fear, confusion, and every inch of darkness. But it couldn't last. The cold began to bite. Davis lost consciousness for 20 seconds before coming to. Marquez was down to a single magazine in a borrowed rifle with a faulty extractor. One man was blind in his left eye from a shrapnel graze. Still they fought. Still they moved. The enemy finally realized they weren't winning. 1 flare. 1 claymore. 6 men, dozens dead. Dozens more wounded or missing, and still the Americans hadn't called for help, hadn't panicked, hadn't broken, because even with no ammo left, they were still in the fight, and the night hadn't broken them. It had turned them into something else entirely. The shadows moved faster now, closer, bolder, no longer probing or circling. The enemy fighters were pushing in for final contact. They had waited long enough. Their leadership must have calculated that the American team was depleted, their firepower exhausted. They were right. What they hadn't calculated was what 6 men trained to kill with anything, and survive with nothing, could do once stripped of all conventional options. The valley had turned into a blur of motion and stillness. The wind had dropped off entirely, leaving only the faint sound of shifting gravel and quiet, deliberate footfalls. The night wasn't silent anymore. It had a pulse now. It beat in the chest of every man lying in wait with nothing but blades, pistols, and instinct. They were dug in around the low depression of the wadi like coiled springs, scattered, divided into 2-man sectors, prepared not for defense anymore, but for contact. Hand to hand, skin on skin, breath on breath combat that belonged to another. Sentry, the first wave came with shocking speed. 5 men rushing low from the western slope, covered in scarves and stripped down gear to move quieter, faster. They expected a wall of fire. Instead, they hit silence. The closest MARSOC operator, already prone behind a cluster of shale, waited until the lead foot passed before he struck. Blade first, punching upward under the ribcage and twisting, then rolling to his side to grab the rifle falling from the dying man's grip. He fired once into the second attacker's chest, muffled, controlled. The other 3 ducked, scattered, shouted. One of them tried to retreat, only to trigger a buried sensor that lit him with the team's last flashbang. The disorientation was enough for Rourke to cross from concealment and take down the third with his pistol at 10 feet. 2 rounds, 1 in the chest, 1 in the throat. The 4th was gone. Gone into the brush or hiding in the rocks, waiting for a better angle. But it didn't matter. The breach had begun. Within minutes, the perimeter tightened. Gunfire returned, sporadic now, mostly from the enemy, unsure of positions. One team of fighters tried to lay suppressive fire toward the north face but overshot their target completely, wasting rounds into empty darkness. Another came too close to the southern berm where Davis was hunkered, wounded and half-conscious, but still alert enough to press the trigger of the captured AK. The rifle jammed on the third shot, but the first two were enough to drop the man who'd gotten within 15 feet of his position. Another enemy squad appeared over the ridge, 4 strong, moving faster, better equipped, likely a reinforcement element. They moved with tight discipline, covered their corners, and signaled silently. These weren't just militia. These were hardened fighters, maybe ex-foreign legionnaires or contractor-trained enforcers. One carried a suppressed submachine gun, the kind not common in Syrian conflict zones. They were moving toward the center of the depression. Rourke and another operator waited low behind a downed trunk. He gestured once, then surged forward without hesitation. The fight was violent and fast. Rourke slammed into the first man low, knocking him backward, twisting the weapon out of his hand as the operator next to him engaged the second target with a brutal elbow strike, followed by a knee to the gut and a knife slash to the throat. The third fired blindly and hit Rourke's thigh, just a graze, but it sent him to the ground. He fired upward with his sidearm, emptying it into the man's chest. The fourth tried to run but caught a boot tripwire that pulled him backward into a jagged outcrop. He cracked his head and didn't get back up. The silence returned, but thinner now, strained. Breathing was loud. Every man on the team was scraped, burned, bleeding, dry-mouthed. They had stopped thinking in terms of minutes. Everything came down to the next second. There was no more thought of extraction, or mission parameters, or communications with higher. Those things had drifted into irrelevance. All that mattered now was killing whoever came next. Marquez crawled to the ridge's edge and looked beyond. The valley floor was littered with dark shapes, most still, some dragging themselves away from the blast radius of the earlier claymore. One man, young, maybe a lookout or a green recruit, was kneeling, disarmed and shaking. Marquez let him go, not from mercy, from efficiency. The fight wasn't over, and he couldn't waste movement. Behind the line, Davis was slipping in and out of consciousness, lips pale, breath shallow. Another operator stayed with him, checking pulse, trying to push fluids through a cracked camelback tube. No one said it aloud, but they all knew, if help didn't come soon, he wouldn't see the sunrise. They wrapped him in every spare layer they had, burying him partially in gear to retain heat. More movement at the ridgeline. Another attempt, this time more cautious. The enemy had learned that a frontal rush would cost them. This new group was slower, more deliberate. 4 men moved parallel to each other, scanning with flashlights turned low, weapons held high. They weren't attacking yet. They were hunting. The team froze. Let them come. Rourke pressed himself into the rocks again, wounds seeping down his thigh, sidearm out but low on rounds. He heard the crunch before he saw the light. One of the enemy fighters stepped into his kill zone, flashlight beam sweeping too far to the left. Rourke lunged, tackling him silently, driving the blade into the base of his skull. The light dropped. The others turned, shouted, fired, but they hit nothing. The dark was no longer their ally. It was the American team's. For the next hour, the valley settled into a brutal rhythm. The enemy pushed in squads, always 4 to 6 men, attempting to probe defenses. The MARSOC team responded with traps, misdirection, ambushes that used the terrain itself. Noise was now a weapon. They bounced small metal fragments across stone to mimic movement, set radios to static to confuse, even used spent flashbang casings as sound traps. Eventually, the fire stopped. Not because the enemy had won, but because they had failed to. The MARSOC team remained, shattered, silent, low to the earth, breathing through cracked lips, vision tunneled, every muscle vibrating with tension. They were no longer fighters. They were survivors clinging to the thinnest edge of instinct. And still, no help had come. But the enemy had stopped trying. And in that, there was something close to victory. They called it the dead hour, that window between 0400 and the first trace of dawn where time slowed, where every shadow deepened and every instinct stretched thin under the weight of exhaustion. For the MARSOC team still clinging to life in the low valley wadi, this hour felt like the edge of existence, not because of what was happening, but because of what might still come. No more direct assaults, no more enemy movement within 20 meters. But that didn't mean the threat had vanished. It had simply shifted shape, from kinetic to psychological, from bullets to silence. The men didn't speak, Communication was gestures only now, shallow nods and hand signals traced in darkness. Their ears did the work their eyes could no longer handle. A snapped twig 2 ridgelines over, a shifting boot sole against stone, the faint hiss of wind passing through dry brush. Every sound could be an enemy crawling closer, or just the earth resetting itself after the violence. Their minds, sharpened by survival and dulled by blood loss, tried to calculate the difference, but found no certainty in anything. Only the constant, gnawing readiness to kill again. Rourke knelt near the corpse of one of the fighters they'd taken down earlier. The man's rifle was jammed, but his sidearm was still functional. He took it, checked the slide, and tucked it behind his vest. His own pistol had only 3 rounds left. His thigh was soaked in blood that had long since dried stiff, and every shift of his leg felt like fire licking along the nerves. He couldn't run anymore. He probably couldn't walk more than 20 steps. But he could still shoot. Still plan. Still think. Davis, the corpsman, was no longer responsive. His breathing had flattened to shallow sips, more reflex than will. One of the other operators had packed his wound again, wrapping it with a ripped t-shirt. The blood had slowed, but not stopped. They draped him in a poncho liner, elevated his feet on a folded pack, and placed a single glow stick near his head. Not for light, but so they wouldn't trip over him if they had to move again in the dark. He moaned once, then went quiet. It was unclear if he was slipping away or sleeping. Nobody asked. Nobody had the breath for words. Marquez stayed low on the far edge of their position, prone in the dust, watching the approach they now called the Ghost Path, a natural trench lined with dead roots and hidden by sloping earth. It was the only way an enemy could reach them without being seen, and for that reason, it had become sacred ground. Every few minutes, Marquez would throw a small stone into it, just to hear the echo, just to measure the silence. Still nothing. One operator rotated through hydration duties, passing around the last quarter canteen, rationing sips by the second. They had long since stopped eating. Chewing felt like a waste of energy. The sugar packets in their MREs had been used hours ago, and the caffeine gum had been swallowed without thought. Now, there was only grit between their teeth, and the ache of muscles pulling themselves tighter to keep from locking up. At 0445, the distant pop of small arms echoed from the eastern slope. Not near them, not aimed at them. It could have been a misfire, could have been rival forces engaging each other in the hills, or a nervous hand. No one reacted. They logged the direction, the sound, the time. That's all. Everything was data now. Information that might buy them a second or two if things shifted again. But the attacks didn't return, and that created a different kind of tension. They were no longer waiting for death. They were waiting for the unknown. Was the enemy retreating? Regrouping? Laying mines? Waiting for dawn to finish what they started? Each possibility had its own shape, its own outcome, and the team rehearsed them silently, mentally, in loops. They ran escape routes in their heads, calculated the odds of extraction without air cover, considered the terrain to the north, a shale-covered slope that would be suicide to climb under fire, but passable in fog. Rourke knew if help didn't come within the hour, they would have to move, even if it meant dragging Davis, even if it meant splitting into pairs and hoping one of them made it out with intel. Staying was no longer sustainable. They had pushed their defense to the limit, bled out their options, and now sat inside a hole surrounded by bodies, smoke, and silence. Then came the static, a crackle. Brief, almost imperceptible. But it came through the SAT handset in Marquez's rig, a tone so faint it might have been imagined. He rolled to his side, pressed the handset against his ear, and waited. Nothing. Then again static, followed by a partial transmission. Broken call signs, a bearing, an ETA, the first real sound of hope in over 8 hours. He signaled Rourke, who crawled to his position, listening to the relay on a shared earbud. A drone, high altitude, scanning the valley. Confirmed American heat signatures. Confirmed engagement area. Air support inbound. 8 minutes. That was the longest 8 minutes of their lives. They didn't celebrate, didn't smile, just prepared. Because survival wasn't guaranteed. Airstrikes helped, but if they were off by 20 meters, they'd be dead. If the pilot misread the flare signal, or if the ridge lines masked the targets, they'd be buried in the blast. Rourke checked his sidearm again. Everyone repositioned. At 0517, the drone buzz shifted from whisper to mechanical hum. Not loud, but enough to alert those who knew what to hear. Marquez triggered the IR strobe, one of the last functioning ones they had, angled into the sky through a homemade frame to narrow its signature. A pre-agreed signal code burned into muscle memory. Then the sky responded. The sound of fast air. A low growl swelling into a scream. The first strike was clean, center ridge. A white-hot bloom of fire that erupted like a second sun behind the horizon, swallowing the rocks and bodies in a soundless detonation that echoed through the entire valley 2 seconds later. Then a second. Then a third, clustered, surgical, precise. The team ducked low as shockwaves rolled over them. Pressure changing, sand leaping into the air, the scent of jet fuel and fire replacing the earlier rot. They stayed down until the world settled, until the hum receded, until the echoes stopped. Then the rotors came, Black Hawk silhouette low and wide over the ridge, nose dipped, door gunners scanning, spotlight cutting through the dust like a blade. A single rope dropped. No words, no commands, just the motion. Rourke lifted Davis himself. One man hauled the gear, another covered the path. They climbed without grace, without speed, but with every last drop of strength they had. Inside, the medics moved fast. Fluids, oxygen, hands working over blood-stiff uniforms and cracked skin. But still no one spoke. Not until the doors closed and the valley was behind them. Even then, they didn't speak. Because words wouldn't make sense, not after holding the hour. The inside of the Black Hawk was vibrating with controlled chaos. Medics worked in tight quarters with gear laid across their knees, and trauma kits flung open like battlefield surgery trays. Davis was unconscious. A cannula in his nose and 2 IV lines snaked into his arms, one pushing fluids, the other blood plasma. His face was pale under a crust of dirt and dried sweat, his pulse weak but present. The other operators sat around him in silence, backs pressed against the cabin wall, boots muddy, faces hollow with exhaustion. They didn't speak. They couldn't. The past 12 hours had taken language from them and replaced it with silence, a language only men who had run out of everything could understand. As the helicopter gained altitude, the sun broke over the eastern ridge like an explosion without noise. Pale yellow at first, then warming into amber, it bathed the valley they had just escaped in golden light. It was surreal. The same terrain that had minutes ago tried to kill them now looked almost beautiful. Calm, endless, layered in soft gradients of heat and stillness. It felt like betrayal. A trick played by time and nature to soften what had just happened. From the air, the ground gave no hint of the blood, the burned vehicles, the blackened craters, or the bodies. It looked like any other piece of Syrian landscape, dry, wide, forgettable. The drone had stayed on station, orbiting above like a silent guardian, its camera systems logging everything. Strike footage, heat maps, infrared signatures. Intelligence officers would later dissect the feed, analyzing patterns, speculating on identities, assigning labels to men who no longer breathed. But for the 6 operators in that bird, the footage wouldn't matter. They didn't need to rewatch what they'd lived. Every detail was already burned into their muscle, their eyes, their sleep. They carried it out with them. By the time they reached the forward field hospital, the sun was fully up. The landing zone buzzed with activity. Medical teams in gloves, air crews offloading gear, engineers coordinating rotor maintenance. But the world still felt muted. As they disembarked, the stretcher carrying Davis was rushed toward the triage tent. The rest followed slowly, in a line, helmets clipped to their sides, rifles slung across chests with muzzles pointed toward dirt. No one saluted. No one cheered. This wasn't that kind of return. Inside the tent, decontamination teams met them, offered water, field rations, and basic medical attention. Lacerations were wrapped, burns were sprayed with antiseptic mist, vitals were taken. One operator had a cracked rib, another had a dislocated finger. All had hearing loss from the concussive effects of the mortars and the low airstrikes. They were told to sit, to breathe, to rest. But rest didn't come. Rourke stepped into the corner of the medical bay and vomited silently into a trash bin, the toll finally crashing through his system now that the adrenaline had receded. His leg wound was cleaned and dressed by a Navy medic who didn't ask questions, just worked quietly and efficiently. He asked if Rourke could still feel his toes. He could. Barely. Marquez was debriefed first, seated under a camo net in a folding chair, boots off, his uniform soaked with sweat and blood. He answered the questions automatically. Call sign, AO name, estimated enemy size, weapon systems engaged. No embellishment, no commentary, just facts, what mattered. He didn't mention how it felt. He didn't need to. The preliminary AAR summary would later mark the engagement as high intensity with no confirmed friendly KIA, 5 WIA, 1 critical. Enemy casualties estimated above 30. Multiple supply vehicles destroyed. A hardened cell neutralized. It would be called a success. The wording would be clean, clinical, dehydrated into bullet points for command briefings and intelligence reports. But the truth couldn't be printed. It could only be felt, in the shaking hands trying to grip a pen, in the sand still embedded in open wounds, in the quiet glances exchanged between men who had almost died too many times in one night. Rourke limped into the command tent shortly before noon. He delivered the physical sitrep himself. No aide, no escort. Just him and a Ziploc pouch containing 1 enemy map, 2 dog tags stripped from local fighters, and a blood-smeared flash drive recovered near the comms mast during the final contact. He said little. He handed it over. Then he turned around and left. In the hours that followed, they were given quarters to rest, rehydrate, and wait for full medical evaluations. The team didn't sleep. They sat in silence or cleaned their weapons, even though they were no longer operationally tasked. Not one rifle went untouched. Not one magazine uncounted. Their movements were automatic, not readiness. Ritual, a way to feel control returned to hands that had nearly lost it forever. By evening, word filtered down the chain that the Valley site had been declared a non-operational zone. Too much activity. Too high profile. Local assets would be reassigned. The ridge would be left to rot under the sun, scrubbed from active missions. The enemy would likely return, rebuild, change names and uniforms. But the fight there was finished. Davis survived. Barely. A medevac lifted him out before dusk, bound for a full surgical team on the coast. He was unconscious, stable, sedated. No one said goodbye. They didn't need to. When he woke, if he woke, he would remember them, and they him. That was enough. In the end, the mission was listed as compromised but completed. The team was told to stand by for reassignment. No awards were handed out, no citations written yet, no interviews. Just a quiet nod from the CO, and a note that higher command had been briefed and approved further action elsewhere. But the team didn't want to go elsewhere. Not yet. They weren't ready. Because while they had escaped the Valley hadn't quite let go of them. And as night fell again, this time safe, quiet, survivable, they knew the real cost of what they had endured would never be paid in medals, or reports, or commendations. It would be paid over months and years, in the way they walked, the way they flinched at sudden light, the way they reached for a rifle before their mind even registered a threat. They had survived. But something stayed behind, buried in the dirt, under the smoke, waiting for the next men who would come through that valley, men who might not be as lucky.